series here, and we're going to have the library's open till 7, so we'll be people around. And I've got a sign-in for you because I keep a email list that I send notifications out about our presentation. The next one I think is going to be in January. Pam Marissa, I believe, is going to talk about the Denny House. Since they bought it, for direct results, and so she's going to talk some about the history of that place. So, how many of you have ever been in the Denny House? I've been in there?
No, not yet.
What's the Denny House?
It's the old building.
It's the red brick building across from Don Patron's.
Oh, it has the 2 lines out front.
Yeah.
Okay. I heard about that, because the same guy at work that was talking about
No, they
Louis
have that
Wetzel.
opened up as what? They have that for, I know that they serve food there.
Yeah, but I think it's just special occasions.
Yeah.
I think it's summer, so there's one evening a week that they do stuff,
Okay.
and it might be in the carriage house, I'm not sure.
Yeah. One of my high school classmates was the son of Mrs. Denny's chauffeur. There's an African-American family that lived in that back carriage house.
Oh.
So, yeah, I went to high school with him. So, anyways, we're glad to welcome Jenny here tonight. And Jenny, I'm going to be over in the reference area because I've got some people I'm taking care of over there.
Well, I want to thank you so much for having me.
Sure.
I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you all for coming.
And Jenny, you can thank Matt. He's the one who put together the flyer.
Oh, Matt, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So I'm going to stop in and out here, and so I'll come back in about 40 minutes and see how to go. But we'd be glad to sort of start to build up our mailing list for our different events. So I'll turn it over to you, Jenny.
Well, as you can all see, I am talking about tonight the 3 invasions of Gettysburg. How many of you have already been to Gettysburg? I know some of you have mentioned. So most of us. Debbie, I drug you.
It was very informative.
I'm going to be talking about the 3 invasions of Gettysburg. The first most of us know about. It is when the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia met there and engaged in a great battle. Some say it was the turning point of the Civil War. The 2 others are direct results of the battle. It is the aftermath of the battle and dedication of the National Cemetery. We will talk about an overview of some events and also some personal stories. So what was Gettysburg like before the battle? There were 2,400 residents and 200 free blacks. It was a very busy, prosperous town. There were 10 roads that brought people into Gettysburg. Unfortunately, the map is not great, but you can see the roads. And by the time of the battle, it did have its own railroad. People came from all over for higher education. This is Pennsylvania College, but it is now Gettysburg College. And also, that's okay, Lutheran Theological Seminary. There were also 2 private schools for girls. This is the Carrie Sheed's house, which is adjacent to the first day's battle. And then the next one is Gettysburg Academy, which is in town. There were 7 churches, 2 banks, an almshouse. Oh, this was a public school that was used as a hospital during the battle. These are the churches. This is Christ Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian Church. This is one of Gettysburg's banks, and it was also, go ahead. This is the orphanage and the almshouse. There were also cabinet makers, carriage builders, a brickyard, and a large tannery. And outside of town, there were approximately 35 farms. Gettysburg was also the county seat. And this is the courthouse. It was first built on the square. Of course, since then it's been moved. Gettysburg had 3 newspapers. The Sentinel, which was Democratic, the Compiler, which was Republican, and the Star and Banner, which was founded by Thaddeus Stevens. Politically, the town was like most of America. Strong feelings about the war were prevalent and many fights happened in the streets. Many residents had contentious relationships with one another, and there were certain taverns in town who would only serve you if you were a Democrat or a Republican. So that was really funny. Go ahead. These are the farms. Go ahead, sweetheart. The Mason-Dixon line is only 8 miles away from Gettysburg, so since the beginning of the war, the residents had been hearing rumors that the Confederates were on their way. In June of 1863, it was true. No one could imagine what was on the horizon for Gettysburg. On June 3rd, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, General Robert E. Lee, decided to move his men north into Pennsylvania. He had many reasons for doing this. His home state of Virginia had been decimated by the war, and his people were starving, and so was his men. He also hoped that a battle on northern soil would force the Northerners, who were already sick of the battle, to call for peace. He was also hoping to get the recognition of the countries in Europe, not to mention the fact that all of the North in Europe still depended on Southern cotton. On June 13th, Governor Andrew Curtin issued a warning to all of Pennsylvania. And shortly after that, 83 local men, including 61 students, formed the 26th Pennsylvania Volunteers. This is their monument if you go to Gettysburg today. On June 19th, Major Granville Howler arrived to command a local defense. At this point, many bankers and store owners started shipping their goods and sending their valuables out of town. Many families left, leaving everything behind. And some men, trusting that their wives and children would not be harmed, left with their family treasures. On June 21st, Robert Bell raised a cavalry to patrol the town, and trees were cut down to block roads. On June 26th, General Jubal Early, which is this gentleman here, rode into town with his men. Soon he finds Town Council President David Kendallhart and demands supplies and $10,000. Now, Mr. Kendallhart already knew that most of the valuables were already shipped out of town. So he told the Confederate Army to let their men, quote unquote, shop. And shop they did. They went all over town buying everything they could with Confederate script, unfortunately, which was absolutely no good in the town of Gettysburg. Residents talked about seeing soldiers with multiple hats on, carrying whiskey, and even petticoats for their girlfriends, I guess. So it was a sight to see. One young man, he as an adult, this is Charles McCurdy, he watched Petey Winter's sweet shop across the street from his house on Chambersburg Pike. And just as the Confederate soldiers were pouring out of the sweet shop, he ran outside, looked into the face of one of the soldiers, and as a reward, the soldier shared his molasses candy with him. I can only imagine, I don't know if it was stupidity or bravery, but he got the candy. This is Maggie Palm. Unfortunately, many of the blacks did not leave when Jubal Early showed up. And the ones that could not get out of town or be hidden were rounded up and captured by the Confederates, supposedly taken south to be sold again. Maggie Palm, this is her picture from the newspaper account. She had her hands tied in front of her, and she gave an account of how she escaped by biting off the thumbs of her captors. The next morning, the Confederates leave as fast as they came, and on June 28th, just south of Gettysburg in Frederick, Maryland, to his surprise, General George Gordon Meade is put in command of the Army of the Potomac. He immediately heads north for Gettysburg. The first invasion, July.
This was 3 days before, right?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
The first invasion, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The 10 roads lead the two armies into town. Meade with almost 100,000 men and Lee with 70,000. Represented were 29 states and Army regulars. Maryland was the only state that had regiments in both the Union and Confederate. Matter of fact, there was one Union general, General Greene, who fought on Culp's Hill. He was a slaveholder, but he fought for the Union. So that is a little bit of how complex the Civil War was. Pennsylvania, New York had the highest number of troops, including our own 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers, which anybody recognize the monument, right? And then one New York unit, also known as the Garibaldi unit, had men from 12 countries represented there. Argentina, Spain, Italy, Nicaragua, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, Portugal, Ireland, and Australia. So really, Pennsylvania was invaded by more than just the South, right? There were men from all over the world. New York was a port city, and they were round up and as immigrants and taken into battle. Gettysburg also had their own men in the fight. The 1st Pennsylvania Reserves Company A, that's their monument, is in town with men from Adams County. As they marched through Maryland, they realized that the Confederate Army was heading right for their hometown and their families. They arrived on July 2nd and fought as their loved ones hid in their cellars. There are countless more that are not on the official records. The Confederate Army had between 6,000 and 10,000 slaves with them. Some of them escaped. However, many of them stayed, and after being asked later on when they did interviews why they chose not to leave when they were already on Northern soil, they said it was because they were concerned of what would happen to their families that were left behind still on the plantations in the South. Armies had doctors and nurses, wives who followed their husbands, working girls, and businessmen who were more than happy to take advantage of the men after they got paid. And let's not forget all the curious people who just followed these armies around to see what was going on. Another aspect were the animals. There's a picture of a Confederate with a slave, but I don't know who he is. And then all the horses. There were 80,000 horses, mules, and donkeys accompanying the armies. They pulled wagons, they pulled cannons. The generals rode horses. There was the cavalry. And most of the regiments had dogs. At 8 a.m. on July 1st, the first shot was fired. Through the fog, this is Marcellus Jones as an adult. Borrowed a carbine rifle, placed it on a fence post, and fired at the Confederates west of town, near the Whistler Farm and blacksmith shop, thus beginning the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the first shot marker. If you go today, you can pull right up to it. It's a really interesting thing to see. The first day brought the loss of the highest ranking officer for the Union Army, Major General John Fulton Reynolds. He was mortally wounded around 10:30 a.m. and as he rallied his men in McPherson's Woods. The tree where he fell became one of the first markers on the battlefield. At the same time, John Burns, this gentleman here, 69 years old at the time of the battle, decided that he wanted to get involved. He grabbed a musket, put on his uniform from the War of 1812, and head out to the battle west of town. He fought briefly with the 150th Pennsylvania, but was wounded 3 times, treated by a Confederate officer, and then made his way home. And after the battle, he was quite a self-promoter. He created cards that had his picture on the front and his story on the back. He did many, many interviews, and by the time of the dedication of the national ceremony, he actually sat with Abraham Lincoln in a church service. Late afternoon approached, the Union Army retreats through town. They go to places like Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. There were skirmishes all night long throughout town, and no one slept. They were in shock for what had happened, and they had dread for what tomorrow might bring. General Robert E. Lee arrives on the battlefield that night. As the sun rose on July 2nd, Gettysburg is already filling with wounded men and trying to hide or escape. Sharpshooters are taking over the attics. Fighting now involves all of town and the farms surrounding Gettysburg. Day 2 involves many of the now famous parts of the battlefield. These are just some pictures. This is the peach orchard, that's Big Round Top. The rocky outcrop is Devil's Den. This is the wheat field, and that's Little Round Top. And many famous people came out of the second day. We have Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Dan Sickles, General Longstreet, and Strong Vincent, all notable people from the second day's battle. Fighting on the second day left farms decimated, bloody fields and streams. The Confederates leave behind one of their highest ranking officers, General William Barksdale. He dies on July 3rd at the Humboldt Farm in the care of Union soldiers under a cherry tree. I'm not sure if anybody know if they retrieved his body? Do you know if they retrieved his body?
I believe they did,
Okay.
and they took it back to Virginia.
On the third day, both armies worked to reorganize. The Confederates, this is a map of what the battlefield on the second day. Go ahead. The third day, both armies worked to reorganize. The Confederates were on Seminary Ridge, and the Union was on Cemetery Ridge. Which brings us to Lee's next order, one of the most controversial of the war, and probably maybe even of all times. He decides that he's going to send 13,000 men across a mile of open ground into the Union center line. But before that, he orders cannon fire. 163 cannon from the Confederate positions start firing at 2 p.m. It was the largest cannonade on American soil, and it was heard all the way in Philadelphia. However, Lee did not realize that all the cannons had overshot their target. And at 3 o'clock, the battlefield grew quiet, just for a few minutes. Go ahead. Within minutes, Generals Trimble, Pickett, and Pettigrew send their men marching into an open field on the bloodiest day of the battle. In about an hour, the battle was over. The Confederate Army suffered approximately 9,000 casualties, which brings us to the high water mark of the Confederacy. They would not fight any further. And this is Cemetery Ridge and the monument to the high water mark. The end of the Battle of Gettysburg, the fields are almost quiet, except for groaning and cries for help. Both armies suffering tremendous losses, and both armies leaving behind their wounded and dead. Now I'd like to share a story about a very brave nurse, a very brave dog, and a man who fought for the Confederacy. This picture up here is Anna Etheridge. She was one of 20 nurses who joined the 2nd Michigan Volunteers. She joined with her husband, James. Unfortunately, James deserted the Army long before the Battle of Gettysburg. She served as a nurse her entire time in the war. Her bravery on the battlefield is legendary. She rode into the front lines carrying a pistol and medical supplies in her saddlebags. We'll never know how many men she saved with her bravery. She was awarded the Kearney Cross, which you can see in the picture, and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And this is her headstone. Apparently she had remarried because she's buried with another man. So I assume at some point she remarried. Now let's talk about Sally. Everybody knows about Sally in Gettysburg. He was a very brave little dog. She was the mascot of the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry. She was adopted as a puppy. She was with them in every battle. At Gettysburg and in other places, she stayed by the wounded men from her regiment until the stretcher bearers could find them. In the chaos, it was hard to tell who was wounded and who was dead. So Sally would basically bark or run up to and run back with the stretcher bearers to get the men off the battlefield. She actually met Abraham Lincoln and unfortunately died in combat 1 month before Abraham Lincoln was killed at Ford's Theater. Wesley Culp This is this gentleman here. One of 5 Gettysburg men who fought for the Confederacy. He was born and raised in Gettysburg, but his employer had moved his business to down south. And he was a carriage maker. And in 1861, Wesley decided to join the Confederate Army. He was captured by the Union in Winchester, Virginia. And while being held, he saw his childhood friend, Johnston Jack Scully. This is this gentleman here. It is rumored that Jack gave Wesley a letter for a girl back home, Mary Virginia Wade, Jennie as she was called. Wesley found himself fighting in his hometown and against his childhood friends. He died there on July 2nd, and Jennie died on July 3rd. The sharpshooter's bullet took her life. She was baking bread at her sister's home on the edge of town. No one knows if there was a letter or if Jennie ever got it, but she did have a picture of Johnston Jack Scully in her apron pocket at the time of her death. 3 days of battle are over. 1 civilian lost her life, and there are 51,000 casualties, both Union and Confederate, in need of care or burial, and is now the responsibility of the remaining citizens of Gettysburg. Not to mention 5,000 dead mules, donkeys, and horses. The carnage is all throughout town and the surrounding land. Soon fires for burning the equine are burning everywhere as the horses were too big to bury. They decided to gather them up in huge heaps and they just burnt them. So if you can imagine, you have dead and dying men, people with nowhere to go to the bathroom, no clean water, probably the food is all gone, and now you have to burn horses. The smell was so bad, everyone wore a face mask that they could find, or they put oils under their nose, but the town and the surrounding areas were just decimated. Which brings us to our second invasion, the aftermath. In a torrential downpour on July 4th, Lee retreats back into Virginia. And as he leaves, the friends and family looking for the dead and wounded start pouring into town. Thieves are also there. Unfortunately, there was always somebody around to loot the dead and dying who were on the battlefield and in town. Doctors and nurses came, and many photographers. We know of at least 12 photographers that covered the Battle of Gettysburg after the fact. This is, let me see if I can do it without looking. Matthew Brady, Timothy O'Sullivan, and Alexander Gardner. Their photographs were sent everywhere. They were probably one of the 3 most famous photographers who were there. If you ever have a chance to look up Civil War photography, one of these guys was probably behind that picture. Many reporters also came. A reporter, Samuel Wilkinson, who's pictured here, was sent by the New York Times to cover the Battle of Gettysburg. He arrived on the 4th in the rain, but he also knew his son was there somewhere. So he took time to look for his son. He found his son, unfortunately, in a shallow grave on the first day's battlefield. And despite his grief, he went on to write one of the best accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg ever published. On July 5th, the Daughters of Charity arrived with 230 volunteers. They set up their headquarters at the St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church. And this is a picture of some of the nuns, which it's a very rare picture. I had not come across it before, tending to the wounded and dead on the battlefield. On July 10th, Governor Andrew Curtin decides he needs to come into town and view the damage and see what the state of Pennsylvania could do to help. He decides that Pennsylvania should bury their own dead and that a national cemetery should be created. And he appoints Attorney David Wills, who's this gentleman here, as the agent for Pennsylvania. Soon, 10 other states send delegates and funds to set up the cemetery. a plot of land is chosen adjacent to the Evergreen Cemetery, and also is part of the battlefield. Men came from all over to bid on the work for the cemetery. Frank W. Bicycle, which I looked everywhere for a picture of this guy, couldn't find one anywhere. He won the bid. He was awarded $1.59 a body to take the bodies from the battlefield and inter them in the National Cemetery. Samuel Weaver, who's this short gentleman right here,
I'll take it.
he took
Thank
over
you.
the colored men who were hired by Beisinger to bury the dead. And the man peeking out just right over here is Basil Biggs. He was already pretty famous in Gettysburg, but then he got hired to bury the dead. And there's a lot of stuff written about him if you ever have a chance to look it up. Unfortunately, no colored troops were permitted to be buried there. It took 2 years for Gettysburg to set up the Lincoln Cemetery to bury the colored troops. David Wills decides that there should be a formal dedication of the cemetery, and he got busy making arrangements. Which brings us to our third invasion of Gettysburg. The dedication of the National Cemetery. David Wills first invites Edward Everett, which is this gentleman here, the most prominent speaker of his day. He was one of the first men in America to have what we now understand as a PhD. He traveled all over America speaking, and David Wills felt that Edward Everett would be the most important speaker that day. He wrote Everett and asked him to come, and asked him if he could be ready by October 23rd. And Everett did not believe he could be ready, so he chose November 19th as an afterthought. David Wills decided to ask President Lincoln to come and make a few appropriate remarks. This is a copy of the actual letter that David Wills sent Abraham Lincoln. On November 18th, President Abraham Lincoln leaves Washington, D.C. for Gettysburg. He arrives at 6 p.m. in a train car draped in flags. Waiting for him was a crowd of over 20,000 people. They came into town to see the president and the dedication. Most of them had been there overnight. There was nowhere for them to sleep. Most of the homes were still filled with wounded. This is only November. So they either didn't sleep, they found a corner to crawl into, or on somebody's doorstep. He's accompanied by many dignitaries and his valet, William Johnson. Among the stacks of coffins, he is met by David Wills, Edward Everett, and Ward Hill Lamon. Ward Hill Lamon decided that he was Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard. They were friends, and he just took it upon himself to guard the president. Very interesting man. They all walked to the Wills home on the town square. This is the David Wills house, and this is the town square as it looked at the time. At the Wills house, they ate dinner. They listened to a band who was playing outside. And President Lincoln at one point stuck his head out and spoke to the crowd, and then retired to his room to go over his notes for the next day. November 19th comes. By 10 a.m., everyone is in the town square waiting for Abraham Lincoln to emerge from the Wills home. He does. He comes out, he gets on a horse, and everybody makes a comment that the horse is too small for him. It looks like his feet are dragging the ground. Abraham Lincoln is in a brand new suit designed and tailored by the Brooks brothers, who, after Abraham Lincoln died, refused to ever make that design again for another man. And if you go to Gettysburg on the town square, there is a statue of Abraham Lincoln that is atomically correct, and his top hat and suit are also correct. They're an exact replica of what the Brooks brothers made him during the dedication. He had a brand new stovepipe hat. And soon they get to the National Cemetery. There are 4 military bands taking turns playing patriotic tunes. Edward Everett spoke first. His speech was 2 whole hours. Then the president rose to speak. He removed a single sheet of paper from his coat, took off his hat. He spoke for only 2 minutes and only 272 words. God. The crowd was silent for a minute and then applause. After that, Gettysburg had been changed forever. From then, there had been reunions. This is reunions of the fighting men. They did the 50th and 75th reunion. These are some of my favorite pictures, that after all that time and all that carnage, that these men who survived these battles were willing to travel back to Gettysburg. There are over 1,320 monuments. People came to Gettysburg for that, for their dedication. Military students, history buffs, and dignitaries. This is the dedication of the Peace Memorial. They say that there were 100,000 people in town that day. And President Franklin Roosevelt spoke. This is the Peace Memorial today. JFK at one time was there, and it is said that he hired one of the oldest battlefield guides to take him around, and he ditched his Secret Service. He didn't want them around, so him and Jacqueline went around the battlefield just with the guide. And from what I understand, when he got back to the Secret Service in the hotel, no one was none too happy with JFK. Go ahead. Dwight D. Eisenhower loved Gettysburg so much that he made it his home. And for a short time during his administration, he ran our country from the 3rd floor of the post office, which is now Gettysburg Library, as it was the only federal building in town. He had had a stroke and he did not want to travel back to D.C. He wanted to be on his farm. Over 1 million visitors a year invade Gettysburg. There are reenactments and hundreds of stories of both soldiers and townspeople to discover, and 6,032 acres of battlefield to study. There are restaurants, wineries, museums, and even some of the buildings still have shells in them, which is a great hunt if you ever decide to go and you look for all the shells that are still in some of the buildings. I really hope you enjoyed yourself tonight, and I hope I've inspired you to invade Gettysburg too. Any questions?
Have you ever been to the Remembrance Day Parade?
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
That is,
Yeah. We went to the parade and then we went to the.
it's very humbling every time you
It
go.
is, and the reenactment of the Gettysburg Address, which I hope now that they know for sure where he gave the address,
Yeah.
I really hope they do it there and not at the podium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It would be nice to see it happen the way
Yes,
it happened.
I really wish they would do the whole thing. I wish they would do the procession.
Parade out of town,
Yeah,
over
I
to the
mean, I
cemetery,
really,
yeah.
the year we were there were snipers on the buildings because there were threats against the parade.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That was something. Any other questions?
So you're saying the Gettysburg Address was only 2 minutes?
2 minutes. It changed the world. People still talk about it today. Abraham Lincoln actually thought it was a failure.
He thought he bombed.
He said something to Edward Everett, and he did not think his speech was well received, which, how could he know? How could he
People
know?
were just awestruck.
Yeah,
Well, he didn't last very long, so.
no.
That's gotta be, you know, the timing of everything, you gotta wrap your head around this, when, who was where, like, when Lincoln died, and what happened here, and, you know, that's what's hard in history to get it down, because you're reading about this over here, and you know, is it happening at the same time, different times, different places? That's one thing when you get to reading that you gotta understand when was where or what, you know? And that's tough.
One of my favorite stories that I didn't include is behind Christ Lutheran Church, which is on Chambersburg Pike, which is adjacent to the First Day's Battle. There was a report that two brothers, one from the Union, one from Confederacy, met behind the church. And I guess one of the ladies in church who was attending the wounded watched these two brothers basically say goodbye. She never knew who they were, but she wrote about it often. It touched her so much. One fought for the Confederacy. She never knew if they saw each other again. And that, I think, is the story of the Civil War. We really did fight our brothers and our neighbors and our friends. And I heard a pastor say that the pastors prior to the Civil War talked about how the soldiers who were joining the Union, they were willing to die to set other men free. And I think that that's one of the reasons I love the Civil War era, is they were willing to die to set other men free. And it was very complex. It wasn't just about slavery. It wasn't just about state rights. It wasn't just about the economy. But that millions of men signed up for service to fight for what they believed in. Some of them weren't paid to fight. Some of them were forced to fight. But the majority of men fought because they thought it was the right thing to do.
It was their own volition. But they did believe. I mean, I don't know if we have strong-willed people like that today or not.
I think we still do.
Do you know anything about, because I was watching videos on YouTube as always, and there was some people that believe that Jennie Wade was actually pregnant when she got killed.
Yes. There is a little museum right in town. It's the Gettysburg Museum. And they got a collection of Jennie Wade letters. Now, there are no surviving letters that we know of from Jack Scully to Jennie Wade, but there were plenty on Jack Scully's body when his family went down to Winchester to collect him, as we would say then. And his younger brother Daniel, for some reason, decided to cut these letters up, cut certain parts out of these letters. So, of course, with that going on, there were rumors flying that they had already been married, that she was already pregnant, or she was pregnant and not married. So, but I don't know that we'll ever know. And I'm really curious about the letter. Like, was there a letter? Was there not a letter? Did she get it? Like, I want to know these things. It really bugs me.
Well, everything leads to a question there.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
Because there's no end to it.
No. There's, I mean, if you could talk about every soldier on every side in every battle, I mean, it would take us 10 lifetimes.
The thing that I find amazing about Gettysburg even today, they still find live shells and remains. And I just,
They always will.
yeah, it just sort of blows my mind, you know what I mean? It's just,
Being in the National Cemetery is very humbling,
yes.
because especially the unknown graves. This
Wow.
men, you know, I guess the families, once the war ended and the men didn't come back, I'm sure a lot of them just assumed that their loved one had died, but it's a fascinating time in American history.
Now, they're both is there both a southern and a northern cemetery sections, or
Absolutely not.
what happened?
The Confederates were shipped south. There were Confederates interred there accidentally, and there was a Confederate soldier dug up in the railroad track. The railroad cut in 1980 or 91. They knew for sure he was a Confederate soldier, and they allowed him to be interned in the National Cemetery. But as a rule, no colored troops and no Confederates were allowed to be buried in the National Cemetery at the time.
Didn't you have a trench down there for them?
Yes. The colored troops and the Southerners, which is why a lot of Southern people came into Pennsylvania to look for their loved ones. They didn't know. They didn't know. I mean, they knew they were marching into Pennsylvania. And I'm sure they just assumed that there's no way a Yankee is going to take care of a rebel's body, right? I mean, it was true hatred back then. They wanted to wipe each other out.
Is there a Confederate National Cemetery in the South?
Yes.
Where?
Appomattox Courthouse. There's one there. There's
One in
several in
Richmond,
Richmond,
Virginia.
Richmond, Virginia.
There's quite a few.
Yeah, I'm sure they're around. The only one I've ever been to is Appomattox Courthouse. Any other questions or comments?
Main thing is, we gotta get out there and look at this stuff.
Yeah, let's just go, right?
But there's so
Don't forget,
many.
November 19th is coming. You can go see the reenactment of the Gettysburg Address and Remembrance Day
The Remembrance Day
Parade.
parade is awesome.
It is, it's awesome.
They said there are like 300,000 people or 350,000. That's a lot of people in
I've
Gettysburg.
been in Gettysburg during the reenactments in July for 2nd and 3rd. The couple years I was there, the town ran out of food.
Yeah, it's just too many people, no place to stay, no food. Sounds like a nightmare to me. It's like Woodstock or something.
I loved it. I didn't care. I didn't care if I had to drive.
Oh, no.
Neither was I.
Most times that I was there for the reenactment, I was camping with the 140th.
Oh, cool.
So I took my own food and I cooked for the boys.
Yeah.
What's the furthest state west that was actually like involved?
In
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg,
Yeah,
Texas.
Texas?
I would have to say
I
Texas.
think.
Mhm.
They fought around Devil's Den.
And at the reenactment, if they do take a charge, it is very real.
That would be
Those
kind of
boys are-
surreal.
Those
to
boys are
see
still
that.
fighting. They come back with bloody noses and all.
Well, it's gotta be real.
I tripped in a groundhog mole and they get charged.
Yes, you did.
Yes, I did.
What did Groundhog say?
He's probably like, I'm not getting out there right now.
Get out of my home.
There's a
That's
lot of
not
really
big.
cool things that go on in Gettysburg today. I mean, Adams County Winery is one of my favorite. The restaurants have become phenomenal. It's become quite a little foodie town.
Yeah.
Is that where
which
you
makes
get
him
your-
happy.
Tears of Gettysburg wine
Yes,
from? Is
and
it?
Rebel Red, my two favorite, Tears of Gettysburg and Rebel Red. The museums are phenomenal. There's a new museum. Adams County Historical Society just opened a new museum last year. It is about the resident of Gettysburg and their experience with the battle. And it's fascinating. And then Gettysburg Foundation took over the train station, and there is a virtual reality experience in the train station. It talks about 3 people. One was a drummer boy. Who was the other one?
Catty corner from the train station, there's a really nice diner.
Oh, yeah, the Lincoln Diner.
Yes.
What were you saying?
The virtual reality, who were the 3 characters they introduced us to? Do you remember? One was a drummer boy, which was very interesting. Huh?
Biggs,
Was it Basil Biggs?
Basil Biggs.
And then one of the soldiers. That was really, I mean, it was only like $8 to do. It's fascinating. They talked about Camp Letterman, which was set up to try to get the wounded out of town. That was really interesting.
Whenever we first, like, yeah, I think me and you did it before we left instead of rather when we got there, but it was like, it's like at the Welcome Center, it has like a museum inside of it, and then you go upstairs and it has like the whole like panoramic
Yeah.
view of
Just
everything.
cyclorama.
Yes, that's actually really cool to do, especially if you've never been there before.
The museum at the visitor center is just overwhelming with artifacts and information, and you can't take it all in. You just can't. And the bookstore is phenomenal.
I think that's the biggest challenge I have every year, is finding a book about Gettysburg you don't have. Because I'm like, what am I gonna get Mom for Christmas or her birthday? A book about Gettysburg. It's not hard to figure out now. What's hard to figure out is if she has it or not.
Well, I have a whole list of new ones I want, so I'll text
Send it
them.
over.
There you go.
Anybody have any other comments or questions?
What's the kid's name that you said would have been me?
Oh, Albertus McCreary.
Mhm.
There was a teenager, Albertus McCreary. He was just rotten to the core. He went out on the battlefield and found the rifles and put the ramrod down into the rifle and shot it in the air. Unfortunately, all these kids out on the battlefield doing this stupid stuff there was a child that passed. There more than one child. There was 3 children that passed because of unused ordinances. But yeah, he would have been the one telling people to climb up on a building so they can see the battle. And every time I go to Gettysburg, I have to stop and say hello to O.O. Howard because he and I share a birthday. So when I get there, I go to his statue, and before I leave, I go and say goodbye to him. It's just one of my silly things I do when I get there.
Another thing that I suggest everybody do if you do go there is there's the Gettysburg Museum of Photos. It's a very small building, but it has pictures of
It's
like
amazing.
every possible known soldier that was fought in Gettysburg. And there's actually families that come from all over to go to this museum. And if they're actually like related to that soldier, the museum will give them the picture, but they take a copy of it first to keep it up. It's really cool. A lot of people, like that's the only pictures they have of their relatives that fought, and they find them at the museum.
Yeah, and if you go to the Pennsylvania Monument, if you had relatives from Pennsylvania, the monument is massive. But I believe they're in alphabetical order, right? By regiment?
I believe.
By regiment, yeah. So that's a really interesting place to find the names. And I love Little Round Top. I know it's cheesy. Everybody says, everybody goes there, but I really have a fascination with Joshua Chamberlain. So of course, every time I go see where the bayonet charge was.
Sure.
And then he and I often talk about Dan Sickles. And, the silly thing he did on the second day's battle was moving his men too far forward and leaving flanking opportunities open for the Confederates. And there's just a lot of things. Lee's order for Pickett's charge was not the only controversy during the battle. You could sit forever and talk about generals fighting amongst themselves about what should be done. Longstreet wanted to retreat, and then he delayed on the second day's battle, getting to where he was supposed to be. And the council that Meade called on July 2nd, a lot of people fault him for that. They feel like he should have just made the calls. However, I think it was very wise because he had not been on the battlefield until the night of July 2nd. Of course, he was going to check with his generals about where everybody was and the state of his army. I don't think that there was anything wrong with that, but I'm not.
They weren't there yet.
I'm not a military historian. So, for all I know, it could have been the worst thing in the world for him to have the Council of War. But the farms are very interesting. Seeing Lee's headquarters was very interesting. That was restored, 7 years ago? To its original state, which is a beautiful little stone house. The house, it was really funny because both Lee and Meade made their headquarters in the homes of widows. The home Lee used, which they debate whether or not he actually stayed in the house or camped around it, but what we know now as Lee's headquarters was actually a house owned by Thaddeus Stevens, and he was basically helping the widow by owning the house, and she stayed there for minor rent. And then Meade, his headquarters was a little tiny white farmhouse, and it was also the home of a widow. So, and then there were 5 other men who fought for the Confederacy from Gettysburg, and one young man came up, and I don't remember what unit he was with, and he really wanted to go see his father, and his dad would not allow him to come home because he was fighting with the Confederacy. He sent word out on the battlefield, told him not to come. There's just a lot of interesting and heartbreaking stories, not to mention the people that were left in town, hiding in their cellars, taking care of the wounded. They struggled for food and water. They didn't rest. Confederate soldiers were in and out of the house, so were Union soldiers. And unfortunately, there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Gettysburg. So the one tavern, they just basically opened up and let all the Confederates drink all night on the first night, if that's what they wanted to do. They were very welcome there in some parts of the town. So I've been there, like I said, over 40 times. And I by far don't know everything, haven't seen everything. And I hope that I can continue to go and explore.
Wasn't Cashtown in a Confederate headquarters also?
Well, they just went past it. It wasn't really a headquarters. It's famous because they went through there. And a couple pictures were taken with the Confederate soldiers on the porch. But they have really good food.
Well, thank you, Jenny. This is wonderful.
Yes, very nice. Thank you.
You guys all be safe going home.
Yeah.
Very good, very good.
And I'll keep you folks posted about our next presentations. Oh, our next one is actually gonna be on November 13. Mr. Bryce Rush is coming from Carmichael to talk about coal mining. He's the guy who has a coal mining museum in Carmichael on Route 88. So he's coming and he's gonna bring a table full of memorabilia from coal mines.
November 13th.
November 13th, it's a Wednesday at 6. Yeah.
Email on there.